Are you getting me back there? We're ready to go? Okay. All right. Raise your hand if you got a Christmas present. I was hoping we'd have every hand. I really was. I was hoping we'd have every hand. Zane, did you get something for Christmas?
I did well. Very blessed.
Zane got a Christmas present. All right. Mr. Steve, did you get something for Christmas?
I did.
And you liked it?
I did.
So we don't need to get on to anybody for you or anything like that? Okay. Well, we are in the last Sunday of the year, if you can believe that. That doesn't do anything to us as a quarter study goes. But if you can believe that we're here, we're here. And we're ready for, we're going to do a little different today in that I just want you to be open primarily to chapter 3. Stay there. Last week we went through New Testament references to back up various references we were making in Ecclesiastes 2 primarily. But I just want you to go to chapter 3. And we're talking about seeking a life that counts, as was the title of my friend Scott's book. And I liked very much. And if you want to know any more about that, I always bring it with me just in case. But I told you before we started, or the first week we started this quarter, I'd draw some things out of there, but then we'd pull from other sources, and then I'd just sort of create my own considerations each week as well. But this week we're just going to look at the text of chapter 3, walk through that, and I hope that'll be beneficial to you. So the first 9 chapters of Ecclesiastes, the first 9 verses of Ecclesiastes 3 are sort of one section, obviously. If you look at that in your text, you're probably seeing a heading above and then a division before the thought changes in verse 10. And so many translations will have something like this above the start of that section that begins chapter 3, a time for everything, or everything in its time, something like that. Does anybody have anything else above that section? If your translation and publisher gives you headings, summaries above the sections, anybody have something besides everything in its time, or a time for everything, or something of that nature? I would. God's gift above chapter 3, a time for God's gift, a time for everything. And so, well, it's interesting that God's gift is inserted there. We'll see that again in a few minutes in a specific verse. So that makes sense that they put it there. Everything in its time is another heading you may have as well. Okay, so let's just start in chapter 3, and let's just look at the first verse to begin. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. Does anybody have a translation to say that uses the word appointed in verse 1? Appointed. There's an appointed time. Anything like that? Yeah. I think the New American Standard, for one, uses that. When we think of an appointment, we think of something that is set for a certain day and a certain time, and might even be very difficult to get changed, or it might have to be put back at least for some time. Obviously, there's something more general right here, an appointed time for everything. But in who's got New American Standard? Go ahead.
But I think it's interesting too that an appointment is not life being lived. There is an effort. There is an intent. There's a deliberateness about an appointment. It's not going with the flow of.
It's not a walk-in clinic.
Well, but it's not. Hey, I ate this instead of that today.
Mm-hmm.
No, I went here to get this, to do that. There's a deliberate.
I even scheduled it.
Whether we have done it or God has done it.
Right.
There is a time frame involved that is intentional.
Intentional here, and I'm glad you said whether. She said whether we have done this or God has done this in this context for this chapter. I'm glad she used that weather in there, because we're going to look at some and ask some questions as to what is it time for me to do, or what do I believe it's time for me to do? What do I recognize it's time for me to do? Where am I in some pursuit of life that is sensible at this time, or some necessary decision sensible at this time? And why am I there because God believes it's time for me to be there, or just for mankind? Mankind, not me. Only me as a part of mankind. We'll look at all that, because it could be either or both and, I think, in some of these situations. If you have this translation, you may have the word appointed, and then you may have and a time for every purpose under heaven. There's an appointed season, or to everything there is a season. Somebody may have the word appointed in your translation, and a time for every purpose under heaven. And do these differ at all? There's this appointment idea and a purpose. So this is why I reference something that I am choosing to consider, to go through, to purpose, to do, or those things that are part of God's providence. Or they may, for me, or they may just be that which God has chosen to allow in the history of man, or just for man. And we'll look at all of that as we walk through these individual times. So the seasons of man, a time. Now, here's the thing. Here's the question, is he referencing that which is appointed in the seasons of man? That is just in general. Okay? Mankind. This is just appointed in the seasons of man. Mankind will go through a time. Each man or woman, each person will have some aspect of this time in his or her life. All peoples of creation, history of the world. In the history of the world, there will be these kinds of times. Is it possible that he's referencing that which he's allowing to happen? Is it more directly that which will happen? Is it for me, or is it without me? You know what I think the answer is? Yes. That's what I think the answer is. It's for me, purposed for me, maybe providentially, or I'm a part of mankind, I'm a part of this world, and so therefore this type of thing is going to go on around me, whether it was for me or for me to choose, or just because I'm here and other people have made that choice. These things are going to go on in their time. And they're going to go on at minimum around me, if not for me, or even chosen by me. And you'll see all those different categories of time here as he enters verse 2. Verse 2, a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to gain and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. I'm not sure how much better a summary, naturally, I would say that we're not going to get much better, if any better, than this summary of all the times and seasons of man. Sometimes by need, sometimes by choice, sometimes by potentially purposed providence, sometimes just allowed through the free will of man. Sometimes to my benefit, sometimes at least I feel to my detriment, sometimes by me, sometimes by those outside of me. But all these times are with us, and we are with all these times. Do you always know it's time? See, just the fact that he says there is this time does not mean I know. You've heard me say this before. I've said it in here. I've said it in lessons in the auditorium. That Jesus, for example, always knew what time it was. Okay? He always knew what time it was in his ministry. In fact, we get references to that. Jesus, knowing that his time had not yet come, and then it says whatever it says after that. And then other times, like in John 13, for example, he'll say, Jesus, knowing that the time had come to, and he goes on and says what he says, and this is the account of washing the disciples' feet. Just because the time exists does not mean I'm aware that the time, at least not initially, what time it is. I don't always know. Now, what, by the way, this is I think should be a rather obvious answer. Can I do anything about that? Remember, the statement is, I may not always know that it's that time. Can I do anything about that?
You can, I know, one thing you can do something about for sure is you say there's a time to die and you jump off a cliff. I mean, yeah, you can do something about that.
Yeah, that's right. I can do something about that.
Be prepared. I think you make it.
Okay, being prepared. Now, let me back you up just a little bit, because I certainly agree. What's going to help me in being, potentially help me in being prepared? Knowing that it could happen. Okay, so Scripture tells me it could happen. So the wise man did his work early, right? Before the rains came and the winds blew and it beat down upon the house, and wise man's house stood firm. Y'all want to sing? We can. I still know it. So do your work early. Okay? There are a lot of people that in times aren't ready. They can't, it's like, I use this illustration a lot just because I think it's an easy picture. And I like easy. Go down to the bank. You got to pull out money because a time is here. What time is that? The time is my transmission blew. Okay, or whatever. We're about to have a massive plumbing bill, and they got to dig from the house all the way out to the line at the street, and that's going to cost whatever. Okay, I'm going to have to let's go transfer some funds. Write this guy a check or whatever. And you go down there, and the funds aren't there. I mean, moms and dads tell their kids all this all the time, right? You don't. I mean, if you want to show your hands, that's fine. And if you need to vent, we can just make this a quick support group. But anybody that's had more than one child, anybody got a spender and a saver with their children? Anybody got one that's a spender and one that's a saver? Just vastly different from one another? I think, okay, these two children came from the same two parents, and then they're vastly different in other things. But I'm just talking about spending and saving. What do you tell them? I'm telling you, you're going to want the. I've got one I don't have to tell. I mean, he's going to be that guy that's got 11 cents out of every 10 he earned. Okay? That's a real saver if you could make it go there, right there. Okay? And then I've got one that is going to need to make a lot of money. Okay? So you can tell them, do your work early. Okay? How about if I ask? How about if I ask? Do you pray for the recognition of timing? Do you pray for that? Have you ever prayed for that? For the recognition of time. And what I mean by time is it's, not that it's whatever time that says there. Not that it's 9:47, but what time it is, according to these seasons that he's walking through in chapter 3. So I may not always know. How could I know? And I would start with two things. I would start with, well, he just told me. Where does that come from? There's only one place that comes from. Okay? There's only one place that comes from. And the place I'm talking about, as good and godly as mom and dad may be, it doesn't come from mom and dad. It doesn't come from the preacher. It doesn't come from the elders. It doesn't come from your best friend. There's only one place that can come from, where you can be absolutely certain. So, digest to be able to understand. Then you ask. I may not always know, but I think I can know more. I used this term one time. This is years ago, and I'll just use it on myself. I was referencing someone else, but I could easily reference it on myself. And if you want to steal this phrase, I'm not suggesting any of you need this phrase. I'm just saying I don't own it. And this has been true. It's probably not true now, but there was a time when I might have said about myself, I'm not fat, but I'm too fat. Does that make sense to you? I'm not fat, but I'm too fat. What do I mean? Well, by the definition most people would have of whatever that is. Here's a marker. Everybody's got a pad of paper taped to the wall. We just go around and everybody draw fat. Whatever that is. Whatever that is to mankind. Whatever that picture is. What somebody's reached that point. Okay, I'm not, but I know what? I know I've got too much of that. Okay, I know I need to do. Okay, well, take that into this consideration. I may not always know, but I can know more. Right? I may not always know, but I can know more. And surely you believe that is true. Always. That is true. I may not know, but I can know more. It's like I can't be sinless, but what is true? Same word. I may not be sinless, be able to be sinless, but I can sin less. That's absolutely true. Okay? So I may not always know, but I can know more. And the best two ways I know on that is study and ask. Study and ask. So I'll be more, as Mr. Steve said, prepared. Pocket, I know. I'm like, which pocket this time? I'm moving around. Thank you. You saw the stem, probably. Okay. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. Which phrase is in the first three verses? Well, let me finish verse 3. A time to break down and a time to build up. Which in the first three verses are bring the most to you? Anything? A time to kill? Yeah. A time to kill. What do we automatically think of there? Okay, war. By the way, there was a study done several years ago by a French historian. Garepidi, maybe, or something like that. I think his name was Garepidi, last name. Anyway, I may not pronounce that right, but that's what it looks like when you look at it spelled out. And I think I'm right about this. I may be off 1 or 2 years. But at that point, and it wasn't all that long ago this study was made, that at that point in the history of the world, there had been 13 years of war for every year of peace. Somewhere, there had been, by comparison, a 13-to-1 ratio. Now, I don't know exactly what his parameters were and how he defined war, and a little skirmish over here, which is really just kind of a Hatfield and McCoy thing, or whether we're talking about war. I don't know, but however 13 years, okay, that would, a time, because one of you said war, a time to kill and a time to heal. You ever go through the Old Testament and see where the Lord told His people to, now when you go through here, wipe them out? David battles Goliath, and what does he do? I'll give you a hint. Last. Cuts off his head. Finish the job. Finish. Zane.
Yeah, I just want to touch on this a little bit because I have a friend who's struggling right now. A time to kill, there are righteous killings. I have a friend who was in career army in Iraq and Afghanistan many, many, many times. He's in his 40s. He's retired. He drinks heavily. And the reason he drinks heavily, I asked him, they don't talk, he won't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I said, why do you drink heavily without getting into details? He said, well, my ears still ring. His ears ring. He hasn't been at war in years. His ears still ring. The reason his ears ring is because he's shot so many times. There's no question he's killed people, and there's no question he's seen his men. He was a sergeant, seen his men get killed. So I think that's something we're not very good at. We have a lot of people coming back from war, and they're a mess, and they have mental, and we don't know how to deal with it, and we're not doing a very good job. So reach out, a soldier or their family, try to somehow minister to them as best you can. It's tough, but if we're not doing it, the world is sure not going to be doing it.
No doubt about that. That's the one I figured that would be selected. That's the phrase I figured. Could have been, maybe somebody else would have picked something else. Okay. I figured nobody would say a time to heal. That's confusing to me. I figured that nobody would say that. If that's what you were about to say, no offense. But my guess was that nobody was going to hone in on that. Even going back to verse 2, obviously we understand a time to be born and a time to die. Hebrews 9:27 says what? Do you know? Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed unto man. Appointment. It is appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. I didn't figure anybody would struggle with that. I didn't figure anybody would struggle with the back half of verse 2. Plant, we could even say go further, water. Okay, now harvest, that sort of thing. But a time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. I didn't figure anybody would really have a lot of trouble with that. Talking even yesterday with a guy who has recently completed, 2 months ago, completed a very intense 6-month rehabilitation process in Memphis with an addiction center. And their program, I guess the way you could say it, their program is one of these that is somewhat based in some military concepts of breaking down and then building up. Let's take that on for a second. A time to, depending on your translation, break down, and a time to build up. Those things stand alone in reason, but sometimes those things go together. Right? Part of a proper building up to make proper again. I mean, think about a house, for example. You got a foundation problem. They may have to come in and kind of take something out underneath, put something else in to shore that up properly. There are things when you get sometimes into significant repair, costly issues with your house, and one of the things that makes it costly is, well, see, Mr. Conley, when this happened, it destroyed this. And so to do this right, we're going to have to go back and, okay? But to properly build up, to stay up in some way, there's got to be a breakdown. Sometimes those things are separate. Sometimes those things are part of, I think, going together. Don, did you?
Yeah, I always kind of look at this as in the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I've done some dog training for ducking and stuff like that. It's much easier to train a puppy than it is to take a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old dog and try to change them in over to, hey, we want you to do this. Same thing with humans. And you got to break down some bad habits to change something where with a child is a whole lot easier. And I'm sure you've seen this in athletics. Take someone that's just going to begin to learn the athletic event, the sport. It's much easier to teach that individual than it is to take someone who's already developed some bad habits. So I always look at this as kind of breaking down the bad habits.
Mm-hmm. We're pulling away. Because I want to go here, I'm going to have to take away here. What did Jesus maybe say anything at all about that, by the way? He said, if your right hand causes you to sin, you're going to cut it off, right? Your eye, you're going to pluck it out. It'd be better to go through life maimed than to go to hell. Better to go through life blind than to go to hell. That I need this, I want this, He wants this for me. We're going to have to. You all have heard, regardless of how it's been phrased, somebody may have to bottom out before they flat on the back before they're finally looking up, right? That idea. Okay, sometimes this is separate in a time, sometimes maybe even through God's providence, this is one and the same. I have had to say this multiple times to a few people over the years. I think it'll make sense to you. You may have had to have a similar conversation at some point in time. You'd better, talking with young couples. Maybe they hadn't even had children yet. Maybe it's part of premarital counseling. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this. You have to understand this up front. Y'all need to be on the same page on this, by the way, if you want your home to be correct. You'd better not wait till they're 15 to start to discipline. You start to discipline when they're 14, 15 years old, and you go, I don't know what's happening. They're rebellious now. They're rebellious. Well, I'm not saying that if you start early, there won't be a time of testing and rebellion, but I'm telling you, your chances are a whole lot better. Good luck starting to discipline when they're 15 years old, and then all of a sudden you wonder why they're rebelling. They've never seen it before. What is this? What is this? Okay. A time to break down and a time to build up. Well, let's look at verses 4, 5, and 6. Time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Look at verses 4, 5, and 6, and what grabs you right there, if anything? Maybe more than some other phrase. Just an impact phrase, something that impacts you particular, or there's a question or a difficulty in verses 4, 5, and 6?
Is there significance in the fact that casting and gathering is spoken of twice within that section?
How about that? Emphasis? It is twice. We're going to cast this away, now we're going to gather them together. Okay? Sometimes the purpose to gather them together is because we need something to cast. Right? I mean, sometimes the purpose to gather them together is okay, we've done that. Now let's okay. I don't know if that has any significance at all in terms of why it's there twice. But I did notice last night, Hannah. Last night I noticed that was in there twice, and it's the only thing I see that's that worded the way it is, so obviously, so closely connected twice. So it is a time to cast away stones. Opens verse 5. Time to gather, and really, the close of all of verse 6 again. Why do you think that is? Is it just emphasis? Let's look at it slowly. Verse 5. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. In John chapter 8. In John chapter 8. Excuse me. Do you know what's about to happen to the woman in John chapter 8? She's about to be stoned. Why is she about? And I don't mean she had drugs. She's going to be put to death. She could be put to death by stoning under the law. Why? Adultery. What does Jesus think it's time to do? Now, by the way, did Jesus keep the law? Or how did Jesus view the law?
It came as fulfillment of the law.
Fulfillment of the law. What does he think it's time for right here? Education, consideration, reflection. All of those things are there, right? You've got to let me educate you on the purpose of this. Let me educate you on yourself. Reflect a little bit on yourself. Consider. And as they could reflect and consider, they walked away. There was no, I have the right to do this. It's time under the law. It's time under the law. I have a right to do this. If you don't want to see it, if you don't want to be here for it, you can go away. We're going to do this. Every one of them peeled off. There's that time, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. By the way, anybody ever gather stones in the Old Testament? There's a literal gathering of stones. David did, to be used for a purpose. Throughout early books of the Old Testament, you see the gathering of stones for the building of altar for the purpose of either sacrifice or as a part of, fuller, as a part of worship. How about the gathering of stones to create a monument, a marker? 1 Samuel 7, verse 12, is we've come this far with the Lord's help. Here I raise my Ebenezer. Hither, use that word lately? Hither by thy help I've come. We've come this far only by the Lord's help. Remember that? So the purpose of gathering stones and the purpose for casting stones, there's a time. I don't know what time it is all the time. I pray for wisdom to know which time it is. And our picture, I think, sometimes is oftentimes even a little more specific, or I think the tendency is our picture is sometimes more specific or more, I hate to just be too general with a word, but negative. Let's find the most negative connotation of this phrase. If we're going to cast stones, well, you said cast away. You didn't say cast at somebody. Okay. So sometimes I think in some of these we're prone to think it direct our comments one particular. But yeah, it is in there twice, and that was interesting to me last night. That's interesting that was the first thing brought up here in this section. By the way, since we're at Crieve Hall, let's look at verse 4. You say, what do you mean? What does that have to do with Crieve Hall? A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Does anybody have the book, Why Is It Funnier When You Shouldn't Be Laughing? You ever seen that book? Why Is It Funnier When You Shouldn't Be Laughing? You ever seen that? That's true, by the way. You know, if you get tickled in church, yeah, because there's something in you that knows your fight. I can't do this here. I can't do this here. And why does that make it funnier? I don't know, but it just does. And so Tom Holland wrote a book. Why is it funnier when you shouldn't be laughing? And he wrote about funny things that happened in church that were incredibly difficult. Now, you think it's hard to stay on track when you're sitting in a pew in worship and something funny happens. I don't mean funny, purposed funny, like, you know, whoever's in the pulpit says something as an illustration or makes a humorous remark about something, and everybody, ha ha ha, and that's purpose. Now, that's not what I'm talking about. Something happens on the pew and down the pew in front of every guy in front of you, whatever. You think it's hard? Try keeping your mind on what you had intended to say next in your sermon. If you are aware of whatever, and it's still going on in front of you, and you've got a fan-shaped auditorium, and it happened right here, so you have to go, I've got to talk this way, because if I look over here, I'll get tickled, and I can't even remember what I was going to say next. Yeah. Why is it funnier when you shouldn't? There you go. There you go. Yeah. So, a time to weep and a time to laugh. And sometimes I think in verse 4, one of the hardest times to recognize is what's in verse 4. By the way, taking verse 4 in to one of the other phrases, which is all the way down now in verse 7. Let's look at verse 7 and 8. A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Okay. Verse 7, a time to tear and a time to sow. Here it is, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. What connection can you make to the close of the second half of verse 7, back half of verse 7, the second time in verse 7, and the first part of verse 4? Can you make any Old Testament reference connection to the first part of verse 4 and the second part of verse 7? Somebody say something. Job. What's the reference? What are you thinking of there, Hannah? Yeah, and they sat with him. And what did they do or not do? Scripture says, not a word. Not a word. Sometimes you merge times. Sometimes you merge times. Part of this is a time to weep was the allowance of it by not trying to fix it. See, that's what was going on with Job, with Job's friends. I got to fix this. And the only way I know to fix this is to say something. This is an issue sometimes with church members, friends. It's an issue sometimes with, it could always be an issue, but until the day we die, even at a ripe old age. But I'm saying, especially, for example, in the lives of younger ministers. Because I'm 25, I've been trained, and I'm in a situation, and I got to say something that sounds like I am qualified in this moment. I got to say something like I sound like I know what I'm talking about. I got to wow somebody with a phrase they've never heard before that'll be the one to get them through this moment. It won't. Okay? But it's time for me to speak. I'm not saying it may not be time for you, but I'm saying it may be time as a part of a time to heal. That's in here. We've already seen that one. All of these, sometimes these times go together. This person is going to need ultimate healing. This is a time to weep, which means it's a time to, third reference in this section, be silent. Sometimes these times go together. Prayer for knowing what time it is. But look at verses 7 and 8. Does anything give you pause or question or just some way it impacts you in verse 7 and 8? Now here's the idea. Going all the way back to verse 1 of chapter 3. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. Now look at verse 9. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task from which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. In its time. When you see this often, when you read Ecclesiastes, you see purpose and time. And there's always purpose associated with the time. He's made it beautiful. Well, I don't see the beauty, right? I don't see the beauty. You go through an elongated, there's people I know just in this room right now who went through some lengthy, sometimes awful battle in unfortunate illness, which eventually led to death with a loved one. I don't see what's good in this, right? I don't see what's good in this. That's our humanity. But in all these times, to everything there is a season, a time for every, here's the word of the New King James, and most of your translations will say something similar, if not purpose. Purpose, a time for every purpose under heaven. That's in verse 1. We're looking at a time, he's looking at a purpose with that time.
If we concentrate on seeking that purpose, the dwelling on it being a difficult situation will not be as impactful.
That makes it at least possible for it not to be as impactful. At least gives it a possibility, an opportunity. Yeah. Looking for that. That's why we talk about study, prayer, to know. But I want you to note that in all those times, Scripture is using purpose before the time. And then he used purpose first, then he used all the times. Then on the backside of all the times, he gets right back in verse 11 to purpose. We'll talk more about purpose next week as we finish up chapter 3, get into chapter 4. We're out of time. That's too easy, Mark. That's too easy. I didn't practice that at all. That was pretty good.